Welcome to Threat Day 2021, brought to you by Group IB and Virtual Vendors. My name's Gary Blair. I'll be one of your two co-hosts today, along with Nick Palmer, who's the head of global sales at Group IB. This kind of Threat Day discussion came out of Nick and I having lots of chats over the last few months on lots of interesting subjects. He says a lot of interesting things. I think I say a lot of interesting things, and together it seems to actually work quite well. So we enjoy ourselves talking to one another, and we hope we can actually entertain you too. I'll give you a little bit of a rundown on myself and the Virtual Vendors, then I'll throw over to Nick to introduce himself. Virtual Vendors was formed at the height of the COVID pandemic last year, and the intention was to actually enable innovative cybersecurity technology to be launched or promoted in Australia and in this region, recognizing that there were limitations on travel and so forth. And we're happy to say that Group IB is one of our key partners in this area. We've had success with other partners too. One of our other partners was CloudKnox, which recently was acquired by Microsoft. So we're good at picking winners, and certainly Group IB is one of these winners. As I'm sure a lot of you who are already customers of Group IB may already know, and those that aren't will certainly see through talking, through Nick talking as he will do. As to myself, I'm the head of the advisory board for Virtual Vendors. I've got a career that spans over 40 years in information security. I'm not proud to necessarily say that because it sounds way too long, but that's the fact, and cybersecurity. With that, I've included 3 tours of duties as CISO of a major bank in Australia, firstly with Westpac Banking Corporation, and then National Australia Bank, and then more latterly Commonwealth Bank. In each case, I was actually brought in to do a transform of the capability, and I'm happy to say in each case that's happened. All 3 of those banks are in good shape. In fact, generally speaking, the banking sector in Australia is, but there's still certainly more work to do. Subsequent to that, I actually founded a cybersecurity research institute along with David Irvin, who's an ex-Director General of ASIO, and that morphed into the current cybersecurity CIC, which has funding, which we actually obtained around about 120 mil over 10 years to do research in cybersecurity. So this is an exciting space to be. The threats are obviously evolving over time, and we see that every day. And that's what we're going to talk about. But before we actually get into the subject, I'll hand over to Nick to introduce himself.
Great, thanks a lot. Yeah, thanks a lot, Gary, and thanks everyone for joining our session today. My name is Nick Palmer. I lead the global business at Group IB. What that really entails is mostly working together with different law enforcement agencies like Europol and Interpol, sharing information about the threats that we see, and also interacting with our customers as well. Group IB, if you don't know us at this point in time, we actually have an interesting history. We started 18 years ago as a computer forensics and investigations company. So really at the heart of everything that we do at Group IB is to research the threat actor, their behaviors and infrastructure, and try to get a beat on them in order to track them ongoing and understand wholeheartedly their campaigns, and work towards the attribution process so that we can again share that information to law enforcement. We've of course developed a lot of different solutions that we're happy to partner with virtual vendors on, but I'm sure they could tell you more about those in the future if you'd like to. But looking forward to the discussion. Gary, thanks a lot for having us today.
Thanks, Nick. Nick, there's an elephant in the room which we probably need to address first up, and it's one that's actually close to my heart because I'm actually concerned about the people who make the companies that we deal with. In this case, it's about Ilya Sakov, who, as most people on this call would probably know, was arrested about 2 weeks ago in Russia on charges of high treason, which obviously the company and neither he believes are actually well-founded, but that's the reality. Can you give us an update on how he is and what the impact on the company is as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So naturally, we're concerned for Ilya. I think, for him personally, this isn't, a great situation. Really, Ilya has always been a very vocal person when it comes to the fight against cybersecurity. He's always challenged different organizations, both government and non-government, to do more in the fight against cyber criminals. And as a result, he may have been targeted for this type of event. And that's really unfortunate, because us personally really enjoy Ilya, and as I mentioned about having that in your heart to investigate cyber criminals and bring them to justice, he's the one that kind of carries that torch very brightly. For him, that's kind of the summary for now. He's kind of going through that official process, and as we have more information, we'll provide that to our partners and customers in an open nature like we've currently done today. For the business, however, it's been really business as usual. I was actually in Washington, D.C. When all of this was kind of happening, visiting with very DC people, let's say. I went to sleep the night before the event, and I thought, this is not good. Oh my God. And then we started to talk with all of our customers and partners, and actually the support from the security community, as well as our customers, partner, and law enforcement, has been really, for me, positive, because I've worked to build Group IB's reputation on the global market for the last 7 years. And to see the cybersecurity industry stick behind us, as well as our law enforcement partners globally, really made me understand what we have built over the last 6 years. One of the law enforcement agencies, I won't say which one, they said, we like you even more than we did the day before, and you're too valuable a partner with too many investigations to give up. So for the company, it's business as usual. In terms of our infrastructure, we had prepared for something like this. I think it's no secret where the roots of Group IB's company are. And as a result, probably 2 years ago, we started to plan for something like this by having both legally distributed infrastructure. So we took the company through transition to become Singaporean based, and now that's our global headquarters by paperwork, but also by people. So we have our global headquarters in Singapore now with 50 people working there, all of Group IB's technical disciplines, and as well our cloud infrastructure. And we actually have local people in Australia as well, and throughout APAC. And we have the same in Dubai and also in Amsterdam, where I sit. And because of that globally distributed infrastructure, there was really nothing that happened to Group IB. We did conduct, however, a full forensics investigation just to ensure the integrity of our own network after the events, even though all that was taken was Ilya's laptop, etc., which were not valuable. I don't know if you've ever sent him an email, but the response can be very very slow. But yeah, so that was definitely a crazy situation in my career, and it's business as usual for us. Ilya has handed over the reins to Dmitry Volkov, our CTO and co-founder, and he's currently absorbed the CEO responsibilities. So in all areas, both infrastructure, people, and process, it's business as usual for Group IB.
That's good to know, Nick, and we look forward to this moving on, and for Ilya to be back in the company fold as soon as possible. We might just start this by actually talking through the current threat landscape in Australia. And one of the things that came to me last week, end of the week, was a comment by Philip Lowe, who's the head of the Reserve Bank of Australia. Now, I know we've got a lot of people on this, or some people on this call who aren't from Australia, around the region, and welcome to this, but it was an interesting comment by the head of the Reserve Bank. He actually said a successful hack on a bank is almost inevitable, were the words he used. That's an incredible acknowledgement from a Reserve Bank governor. But then you look at what the IMF has said in recent times, you look at what the Financial Stability Board has said in recent times too, and you can see that there is concern, heightened concern, that even companies like banks, which really are at the top of the totem pole in terms of being able to protect their assets, are nonetheless at risk in this current world that we live in. And if you actually context that with some of the recent ransomware attacks against some big names in Australia, Toll Group, 2 in short succession, 9 News, a range of others, even our academic institutions like the ANU, Australian National University, and you can actually see that there's a considerable amount of activity affecting even large organizations that should be well prepared for this type of event. And if you turn your mind to the Australian Cybersecurity Centre's annual report, which came out in August, that actually highlighted a whole host of statistics, which are actually very interesting. You know, $33 billion in lost revenue from, or losses to cybercrime, over 67,000 reports, 25% of those reports relating to critical infrastructure. So again, you would normally say people in the critical infrastructure sector would be better prepared, but nonetheless, and all of these results are self-reported, these stats. So it's likely that the impact is greater than that. And then we turn to the global view, which I know Nick will do too, and you look at all the types of critical systems attacks that have actually occurred in recent times, like the SolarWinds attack, like the Hafnium exchange attack on exchange servers, Cassia attack, and so forth. And we can see that this is a very real issue that we're now facing, all of us, every day in the security world. Nick, what's your impression on the current state of the cyber threat?
So I think from a global perspective, and probably certainly from an Australian perspective as well, what we really see is, less targeted attacks on financial institutions from financially motivated threat actors like Cobalt and Silence, etc., who formerly, used to target card processing systems or ATM systems or SWIFT systems within the banks. And what you actually see is, more of activity, getting early access, selling that access for ransomware purposes. You see also botnet operators who used to target credentials of different financial institutions and conduct fraudulent activity against those compromised accounts, shifting as well towards providing early access to different ransomware groups that may want to also use those initial accesses for attacks. Definitely also a hardening and efficient way in which the ransomware groups are actually running their businesses, the way that they communicate with different affiliates through control panels to organize who can target which company, profit shares and tools and things like this. So it's becoming a very official business process that I think the cyber criminals are actually looking to scale. And scale in every way of the term that you'd think about in a business way, from organization to promotion to the operations of their business, quote unquote. So those are a few of the things that we're seeing on the global scale, and I'm sure you guys are seeing some of that too down under.
Yeah, we certainly are. And look, Nick, I like where you actually were taking this conversation, because one of the things I think today we should be talking about is this ecosystem view, looking at the cybercrime ecosystem view, particularly around malware and ransomware, looking at the developers of the actual malware, looking at the developers of the ransomware platforms, ransomware as a service, and then looking at the affiliate model. My inclination is, and obviously goes on beyond that too, but when you're looking to defend against this, you've got to look for weak points in this whole supply chain that they've actually established. But looking at the upstream, at the malware development, what are you seeing as interesting developments in terms of the groups and the capacity they have to actually develop new malware based on zero-day exploits or on exploits that haven't actually been published? And what is about that market for unpublished zero-day exploits? Let's start there.
Well, I would actually think that the ransomware groups and the TTPs that they employ are relatively rudimentary. When you compare the targeted attacks that different financially motivated groups like Silence or Cobalt or Lazarus used to take to actually gain access to a bank's infrastructure, figure out how SWIFT systems and payments work, stay in the network for periods of 2 to 4 months before actually conducting $300,000 transfer. Those were, for all intents and purposes, a very incredible effort by cyber criminals to actually learn how these things happen within a financial institution. And I hope they all get imprisoned one day. And I think why you see a trend towards cyber criminals actually moving to ransomware is that it's much easier to conduct. There's affiliate programs where you just have to buy access. The developers will actually just give you the instructions, step-by-step instructions. I think, you've seen recently with some of the leaks of the actual ransomware documentation, how organized and operated they are with their affiliate members. And it's really because of scalability, right? If they can use the information from TrickBot or QuakeBot or Dridex to identify initial compromises within networks that they're already doing with their botnet operations, then they can easily use different tools to propagate within the network and then drop ransomware or exfiltrate documentations to put on a DLS site, following the step-by-step instructions that different ransomware groups who operate affiliate programs actually provide to these individuals. So, in terms of tools, I think it's relatively, rudimentary in comparison to what we saw actually 3 years ago. I think if you look at other organizations, whether it be nation state or maybe more high-profile ransomware groups like Revo, for example, they may up the game when it comes to a tool set. But, in terms of developing zero-day malware and things like this to gain initial access, I would dare say that they don't even have to go this far in terms of the investment into their business. They could simply go to a TrickBot, QuakeBot, Dridex, review all of the compromised hosts that they have within their botnet operations, and select the organization that they would actually want to conduct the attack against with, TTPs that everyone should be aware of at this point.
And that's the classic cybercrime model. Why use a tool that's special if you can actually use one that's actually fit for purpose, does the job? They're very practical in the way they go about their business.
Yep.
And really what you're saying is that the development and innovation is in the platform that actually, and the control panels and the orchestration, as opposed to the actual malware itself. That all makes sense.
Yeah, cost and complexity, right? They're trying to minimize both. Yeah.
Yep. It's a software engineering business, it's just not the right one. So with that and the affiliate model, is there any way you can get to determine how big that affiliate model is? Like do affiliates actually move between platform providers? And how distinct are they from the platform providers? In terms of the actual and size and scale, and whereabouts are they? Where are the affiliates based largely, in your view?
So we had a really nice report that we did. Excuse me. It's called Ransomware Uncovered.
Yep.
And it talks about all of the different trends within ransomware. I'm sure maybe Gary, you could send it out to all the participants. But within this documentation, we really talk about the increased speed at which different affiliate programs are being developed. And in 2020 alone, there was 15 new affiliate programs alone, in addition to the already 10 plus that were in existence before that. So, the options for different mid-skill cyber criminals that want to conduct these types of attacks or use information that's already been compromised from other groups is plentiful. I think, into the 2021 period and beyond, or 2022 period, sorry, and beyond, probably we'll put our business hats on and, start to see consolidation in this ransomware as a service industry. You'll see those players that become most efficient and most easy for people to use being the leaders, and then others will kind of fall off as their return on investment dies down. In that research that we did, we also saw a lot of botnet operators actually starting to utilize more of the information that they're actually compromising. So if you look at TrickBot, for example, they started using their commodity malware to drop ransomware like Ryuk, Conti, Revil. They would all use information found within TrickBot to actually conduct attacks. And if you've ever seen the backend infrastructure of C2 control panels from some of these commodity malware, you'll see the tens of thousands of both individuals and organizations that have pinged out to the command and control infrastructure with an infected host. And this is really, a menu for cyber criminals to go through. They go through the control panel, they leave comments, this organization, don't touch it because this individual is working on it. I've locked it with Re-Evil communications program for all of the cyber criminals to see. So that's some of the things that we're seeing in this area. And definitely we'll see a lot of consolidation in the affiliate groups go forward into 2022.
Yeah, and what does this mean for the targets, for the victims of ransomware? Which we've seen the sectors that have been targeted. Certainly through COVID, we've seen the extension of the attack surface through working from home and all of that. But are we likely to see bigger ransoms, more attempts? I preface that by also mentioning that Chain Analysis did they do an annual report on his illicit funds transfer through cryptocurrencies, and the biggest single mover across all the illicit uses of cryptocurrency is ransomware, year on year, and unsurprisingly, I guess. But I guess I'll let you answer that first, but then after that, I also want to talk about the issue around pay or not pay if you're actually in that situation where you're forced to, you're challenged with the ransomware attack.
Yeah. I think it was a really interesting situation to watch some of the ransomware groups actually react when somewhat hard and swift focus was placed on, scolding these ransomware groups or countries where they may be hiding out, and, watching them actually take a break for a little while to see what will turn out of this. So, I think if different organizations can come together and put pressure on those individuals or countries, or even continue open dialogue where it may not even be feasible to put pressure on, to say that that's not okay, to make public examples through researching and working with law enforcement of maybe picking off other groups that are operating in different countries that are accessible to law enforcement. I think we'll see a decrease if that's the case. I certainly think that we'll see, like I mentioned before, a consolidation into the affiliate programs. But I don't think that would actually mean a reduction in the number of ransomware victims as we go forward, just a more professionalization into the ransomware as a service programs that are being offered. And I think, for different potential victims, anyone that's operating, any organization should be aware that this could happen to them at some point in time. So, it would be great to see more efforts taken to run different war rooms where they could prepare both from a technical perspective, but also, think about your call center or your legal team or your PR team. How would they actually react? Not only your security team, because when that type of mess hits the fan, you're going to have all hands on deck, and they should know and understand how to react to something like this, not only the security team within the organization.
Yeah, that's a good point, Nick. I always advise my clients, and I'm very pleased that the clients I work with, pretty much once they've gone through building their incident plans, will actually form a view at the board level not to pay, and actually work on that as their primary strategy. But I actually attended a webinar this morning hosted by the Australian Institute of Company Directors, and David Thodey, who's ex-CEO of Telstra, and now chairman of CSIRO and other organizations. He also had the view that you shouldn't pay, but he said that under certain circumstances you may be forced to. I think with the right preparation and planning, you should never be in that situation where that actually comes to pass. But Nick, you and I have also talked about the role of insurance in all of this, and I think we probably have slightly different views. I actually think the insurance industry has actually aided and abetted the ransomware as a service model, because prior to ransomware, insurance industry found it very hard to price insurance around cybersecurity, whereas ransomware has actually given it a price. And of course, they are now charging premiums on basis of that price. It kind of means that the two groups together work almost, both groups would deny it, but hand in hand. But you have to say, for example, I've heard that various of the ransomware groups will actually go after the insurance policies to see exactly what the payout is. Then they know how to price their ransom based on that insurance policy. So a number of people, myself included, are of the view that maybe insurance policies shouldn't cover paying ransoms, should cover all aspects of other aspects of cybercrime, but not the actual paying of ransoms, because would that actually then reduce the value of a ransom? Over to you, Nick.
It's a very loaded question, Gary, as always. I would say kind of short and quick that my own personal opinion is to never contribute to the return on investment of cyber criminals, because ultimately that's why they're in this game, right? Is to make money for the largest majority. But I'm not in that situation in an end customer, so being put into that situation, you never know how many multi-millions of dollars are you losing at that time with your business being offline, etc. External pressures. So I'm not going to sit here and say that I would never do it. I personally would never want to see that happen because on the other side, I know that it propagates further activity from cyber criminals. And I think that's a really interesting point about the insurance segment, especially from a cybersecurity perspective. I think I won't say how I know this figure, but if you look at the actual payouts from different cybersecurity insurers, it sits around 80% of all of the policies that they're paying out, something in regards to responding to an incident. And obviously the goal for insurance is to never pay you, no matter what. So I think, that for the insurers is really a tough situation right now. They have to look at things and consider how are they going to reprice their policies for organizations based on a proactive understanding of what they're doing to actually prevent something like this from happening in the first place. And I think that's probably what we're going to see in the insurance segment is things like what you said, paying for incident response, paying for, other types of things to help organizations respond and recover to incidents, but not pay ransoms. And also, I think in the insurance segment, when you go to renew your policy in the very near future, you're going to see a lot stricter activities from the insurance company to actually evaluate what you're doing to protect your network from this, to make sure that your organization from a non-technical perspective is ready to respond to something like this, or your reinsurance or your subscription again is going to be incredibly expensive. Yeah. So I think that's what's going to happen in the insurance space in the future, because at the current kind of payout percentage, it's not really a super feasible market.
And look, I think that's entirely the right way that the insurance industry should go. There should be differentiation between those people who have invested in their security up front versus those that have actually not invested and are totally relying on transferring that risk to their insurer and just collecting a payout. That actually brings us to the other end of this whole ransomware model, because there are also the brokers on that side who actually now have evolved into, as a business, in terms of negotiating ransomware settlements with with customers, with victims. And of course, that's not an entirely honest market too, because there's also stories around that of those brokers taking a cut, a percentage fee of what gets passed on to the ransomware attacker. So dirty business all the way through. Turning to law enforcement, and you mentioned on a number of occasions the way that Group IB works with law enforcement. And as people probably on this call know, that's with the Interpol and Europol and other law enforcement agencies. What are realistically the chances that a given attack can be accurately attributed to a given attacker, and how likely is it that that attacker will actually be prosecuted in a court of law?
So I think when it comes to attribution, obviously this is not an easy process, right? But as you collect more and more information from previous events, you start to develop similarities and patterns in, the tooling and the procedures, in, how they move laterally, what tools they use, and you can start to put the pieces of this puzzle together to actually understand which group this is. Maybe even identify different control panels, watch communications, operations, get profiling of different threat actor nicknames, use, OSINT and other methods to investigate data points you found. And, the process of attribution and working with law enforcement is not a quick and not an easy one. But, I think there's been numerous examples in the past of successful investigations and arrests of cyber criminals, some in the recent few days in the Ukraine. And I think that, for us at Group IB, it's an important part of why we actually wake up in the morning at 5 a.m. and do what we do to make the world a better place at the end of the day. So I think it's entirely possible. I think, in certain regions, it's more challenging than ever to get nations to respond to different ransomware groups that are, operating with impunity. But I truly believe that even during difficult times, it's absolutely essential to keep open lines of communication about what's right and wrong and what the repercussions are going to be, etc., or what the collaboration could be in order to actually disrupt this type of activity. So.
Do you think law enforcement is doing enough to prosecute cybercrime? And do they have the right resources to do it?
So, we've been working with law enforcement for some time now, certainly through all my 6 years at Group IB, and, the things that we're able to see them do and the speed at which they're actually conducting investigations and, arrest, and the volumes are increasing over time. And, if you look at some of the law enforcement agencies, like, the capabilities are really cool. You can give them pieces of information and they can spin off of an investigation on that. They've also developed, some law enforcement organizations have developed, really unique cadence with, their legal attaches and things like this, to, once a vendor has provided information about, a C2, etc., then sometimes there's possibility to actually get some information back to continue investigation and enrichment of that information. So, I think they work tirelessly to actually perform attribution and arrest. It's not an easy process, working with multiple jurisdictions and uncooperating nations, or, bureaucracy, whatever it might be. But what I see is certainly increasing capability, increasing volumes and frequency at which they're actually conducting arrest. And, I think ultimately those examples that you make of cyber criminal groups through collaborating with law enforcement sometimes make them go quiet, right? And will make some other individuals think twice about using an affiliate ransomware program to start their activity in conducting attacks against organizations. So, yeah.
That makes sense. What about, you mentioned governments and what they can do, but and international bodies, are they doing enough to ensure that states don't harbor cyber criminals or turn a blind eye to their activities? Or is there more that the international community can do?
I would say that there can always be more, right? I think it's no secret that some cyber criminals, operate with impunity, because they're protected in some way or another, right? But I think on the vendor side and on the corporation side and on the government side, it's important to always have those open dialogues with different nations, etc., in order to let them know what's okay and what's not okay and what the repercussions will be, or how they can cooperate and be successful with actually making this activity reduced or stopped. So I think there can always be more that's done in this matter.
I might just turn to some of the things that are being done in Australia, and some of the recent initiatives over the last few years have actually come in for some criticism in some quarters in Australia. For those that aren't in Australia, this would probably be news, but those of you in Australia will probably know of some of these at least. But there were encryption laws that were introduced a number of years ago, and that actually it required, through a series of 3 processes, firstly a technical assistance request where the government could issue that to a telecommunications provider to actually gain access to a certain transmission. If that wasn't successful, they could then issue assistance notices, which were actually more directive. And if that wasn't capable of actually delivering an outcome, they could actually ask that communications provider to they could direct them through a technical capability notice, which meant that they needed to build that capacity so that the next time that request was made, they could actually then act on it. So there's that legislation. Other recent legislation that has come into law this year has been the Surveillance Legislation Amendment Identify and Disrupt Bill, which is an interesting bill because, well, it's an act now. And that again enables the government agencies to actually access social media accounts or other accounts, monitor and surveil those accounts, potentially inject data into those accounts, and also track communications through that. And then more recently, there's the Critical Infrastructure Amendment Bill, which is the Security Legislation Amendment. And that again, it looks likely by virtue of it having gone through the Parliamentary Joint Committee of Intelligence and Security to be split into 2 acts, one to be passed in this setting of Parliament, and then the other sometime next year. In the first instance, it does actually increase the number of critical infrastructure designated sectors to 11. It also identifies the notion of systems of national significance, which are a subset of those systems within those 11 critical infrastructure sectors. And it imposes a set of positive security obligations on the 11 sectors. It imposes a set of specific objectives on the owners and operators of those systems of national significance. And it also entitles the government to do 3 things. One is to seek information in the context of a system that is under attack, direct certain action in regard to that system under attack, and if that's not successful, to actually lend assistance, direct assistance to the organization, the owner-operator of that critical infrastructure, to enable them to defend that system. Obviously, people have seen that last activity as being one that seems to be quite Big Brother-ish, some people would say. I don't happen to see it that way, because the whole package of legislation is intended that there's closer communication and engagement between government and industry, the owners and operators of critical infrastructure. And a lot of this would actually have been worked through in terms of the planning and preparation. So it's not like somebody from Australian Signals Directorate coming straight into the organisation, sight unseen, unknowing your network and actually taking over. It would have been people that would have worked with you through role plays and other kinds of events to actually role play this kind of scenario and make sure that each party knows what they need to do under these circumstances. So in my view, it's good, reasonable legislation. It has a series of checks and balances in terms of independent bodies that actually review this legislation from time to time, as does the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Intelligence and Security. They typically set a time frame of about 3 years between the passing of legislation and when they'll actually review the performance of that legislation. So generally speaking, this would put Australia probably at the forefront amongst at least the Five Eyes countries, according to my research, in terms of its ability to actually make Australia a hard place to do business as a cyber criminal. Nick, as a Canadian and as head of global sales for Group IB, what's your view on these types of legal settings, legislative settings, that can actually perhaps turn the dial in favor of the good guys, so to speak?
Yeah, so I'm sure you guys have had active conversations about this topic since it's been introduced. You know, I never like to understand that there's laws and regulations being put in place that feel a little bit big brotherish, or that could be used by the government in order to just take over different infrastructure that they want to, for example. You know, in that respect, I would kind of maybe put that in a little bit to the overreaching area, but I think it's all in perception as well. You know, I think if you're operating critical national infrastructure, and you know, if that definition becomes more loosely defined, you know, then it could be an overreaching policy. But you know, if you look at critical national infrastructure as it is today, which is, you know, services that are required by the citizens to not lose their mind if they're not working for a couple of days, you know, then I think what you have is really a centralized body that's going to be providing support and recovery assistance to organizations that can't do it themselves. Also a centralized body like ensuring organizations are actually taking proactive measures to understand what the TTPs of these ransomware groups we've talked about today, or other adversaries which might target critical national infrastructure. So taking steps in those right directions to harden their infrastructure and actually prevent against it. If they're not, then providing them capabilities that they may not have in-house to actually, you know, respond to these types of events that may happen, so that, you know, there isn't a direct impact on the citizens. And then possibly taking over that infrastructure if they can actually do it themselves. So I think, you know, there are a lot of positives in the legislation, definitely a lot of positives. A few kind of concerns over on the, you know, I wouldn't want the government overreaching type thoughts. But I think, you know, by and large, when I look at any legislation, there's going to be huge positives and huge, you know, sometimes huge negatives as well that you have to take into consideration. And, you know, I would say by and large, it has good spirits built into it. It has good requirements built into it for organizations that are providing, you know, essential services to the citizens of the country, which need to be online for people to use. So I think by and large, it looks like a very positive change and capability in the right direction.
I thanks for that. And look, I heard a US commentator. He's actually works for the Council on Foreign Affairs, and he said that in the US, because this kind of legislation doesn't exist in the US at this point in time, generally across sectors, there's some sectors that are quite well prepared, but in many of their critical infrastructure sectors, it's a race to the bottom, who can spend the least on security, not who can spend the most. Whereas I do think that what we'll get out of this is the right-sizing the investment in cybersecurity across those industry sectors, the critical infrastructure sectors, and they are defined. There are 11 of them, so you know it's not like there's going to be leakage into the rest. But I think those 11 sectors will start to actually, as this legislation takes effect, as I say, it's likely to take effect in 2 tranches. This key legislation around critical infrastructure over 2 years. We'll start to see benchmarking better able to be done in sectors and across sectors. We'll see what works, and we'll see how resilience is actually delivered through this type of thing. And there are checks and balances in terms of the way the warrants are executed on a case-by-case basis, And there is this oversight of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, who will actually do the review in 3 years' time of that legislation. So in my view, the checks and balances are right. I think it sets the scene for organizations, for boards particularly, to actually understand how they actually identify the risk appetite around cyber and how it's actually prescribed in a way that actually is contextually related to the importance of what they deliver to the country. Because all these systems are actually important, defined as important in terms of the social and economic and national security of the country. And that's consistent across the Five Eyes countries. And indeed, Singapore has similar types of approaches to critical infrastructure too, as does Europe as well. So progressively, I think we'll see this start to play out. I wanted to talk about one other aspect which comes up from time to time, and Dmitry Operovich was most recently commenting on it in a New York Times article on active defense. And is there a role for active defense in fighting cybercrime? And if so, whose responsibility is it? Is it only law enforcement, or can the private sector actually take up that kind of active defensive approach? What's your view?
The first thought that came to my mind is, if you can't protect yourself, why are you going offensively, right? So, I think if you leave it to different corporations, there's, you think about kids fighting on the playground, and someone who can't defend themselves against someone who's been doing offensive actions for a long time. You might not want to pick on that kid in the playground, right? So I think for corporations, really focusing on growing their business, interacting with their customers, hardening their infrastructure, understanding who those threat actors might be, the TTPs that they use. This should be fundamental in the defensive posture in the event that that kid on the playground picks on you, for example.
I'll just jump in there. I mean, intuitively, I agree with you, and legally, that's the right answer, because it's in Australia, at least, it's computer trespass if you do anything else. But there is a grey area, and I'll give you an example. Back in the early days of phishing, the bad guys would actually store their credential caches before cloud, before any kind of virtualization, just on some unsuspecting server in some small business that didn't know that they happened to host that. They didn't know they'd been compromised. A lot of the banks I actually, where I directed the security teams, we would actually trace those security caches. In the early days of credentials, they weren't even encrypted, and we could just take a copy of those credentials and then do outbound calls to our customers to ensure that they actually changed their passwords and reinstated their security. They were very immensely satisfied with that kind of service. It saved them money, it saved the bank money. It's the grey zone, however. Subsequently, the bad guys started to encrypt those caches of stolen credentials, and we then needed to actually deploy decryption techniques to actually get it. In the early days, we could do that too. So, I'm saying that there's some activity that probably is in that grey zone, and I want to talk about grey zone too before we wrap up. But in any event, I take your point that the right legal answer is don't go anywhere near computer trespass, which is typically where you get to with active defense. But it's certainly something that law enforcement and government agencies are talking more about, even if they're not talking about their actual TTPs that they own, but the fact that they're actually building that capability.
I still think from a private perspective, like, you have to look at have to look at it economically, right? Like having those capabilities in-house, yeah, for some organizations, it's possible to do their own research into the dark web on a computer that's not the corporate computer, or, to try and collect information from C2 control panels. But, eventually you have to look at what's actually possible. You might lose a couple of the individuals to another competing firm and then lose that visibility. So, ultimately for a commercial organization, I think, looking at how you can harden your defenses and researching different actors is, probably more important in the equation of the grand scheme of things. For the offensive side on the government level, I think it's essential that they are actively collecting information about their adversaries as well, right? As much as we look at our businesses as potential targets, they have to look at it from an entire country perspective. I don't really want to see a world where there are cyber attacks being launched against different nations that, disrupt critical national infrastructure like we saw. I think that's just a small taste of what could happen, in the future if that type of behavior escalates. And that could be really detrimental, looking at things. So, I hope more effort is placed on diplomacy and also on hardening that critical national infrastructure and making sure that they can't be taken offline by some implant that's already there, et cetera, because that's not a world that goes very far, unfortunately, I think.
I absolutely agree. And I just want to turn, before we wrap up this part of the session and throw to questions, we haven't talked about the insider threat, but that's obviously one that increasingly becomes of concern as these cybercrime groups get better funded. They can fund insiders. They can place people inside organizations for longer periods of time. They can do it as part of a more targeted campaign. And it's potentially the ambit of cyber criminals, but also state-sponsored activity as well. What do you think, and how relevant to the operations that you conduct is the insider threat, particularly if it's combined with an external attack vector?
Well, I think anyone within, if you're running a 10,000 person organization or, a 100 person organization, you may have someone that doesn't like you, right? And unfortunately, that's a real concern that you have to be aware of. Understanding what data is leaving your premises, understanding what happens if that data is trying to leave the premises. Is it encrypted? Is it not? Someone maybe trying to sell access on underground forums or look for somebody to cooperate with. What are you doing to actually monitor for this type of activity on the underground or on other communication points that may mention your company's name? So I think it's just another vector that can be used and should be taken, seriously. Lots of people don't like me too, right? So you have to actually take a look in consideration at what could happen from an insider threat perspective, because ultimately one person's not going to like you someday, and that could also be an impact to your business, right?
Yeah, it could also be duress too. So it could be that they are forced to do something too, and there could be a whole host of other reasons why it happens. But my biggest concern has always been that combination of inside knowledge and external attack vector, which actually anonymizes the attack, but actually is based on inside ability or somebody being able to surreptitiously open a door so that the attack can actually occur. That I think is, and in fact, the critical infrastructure legislation does include some enhanced requirements around vetting on certain positions of trust with regard to critical infrastructure too. Again, that's come in for some criticism, but I have to say, in my days in banking, our CERT team did annual clearance checks, every member, because it was a position of trust. And I believed it actually protected them as much of the organization. It demonstrated that they were actually operating at that level, that they could obtain that clearance. But Nick, as we're coming up to 5 to 3 here in Sydney or in Australia, any final thoughts before we actually throw open to the floor?
No, I think nothing from my side. Thanks a lot, Gary, for the conversation. You know, I think it's an exciting time, both from an attacker perspective, but also, you know, critical national infrastructure and our own businesses and understanding what's happening in the landscape and how to prevent against it. So, you know, I'm excited for the future. I hope it goes in the right direction. And thanks a lot again for having us, Gary. Appreciate it.
You're welcome, Nick. And I believe you've got a question on the on chat at the moment. So can you see that there, Nick?
We get this question from time to time. So the question's, what would happen if Group IB detected a state-sponsored group operating in Europe, US, Japan, etc.? North Korea is one thing, but how about the developed world? If you were our customer already, you would understand what has been reported. So, you know, I'll just probably leave it at that. But our job as a company is to actually conduct research. You know, we, as you've seen now, are, you know, not partial to any nation whatsoever. And you heard the words in public space from Dmitry Volkov. It's business as usual for Group IB. We're going to continue to diversify our business internationally and report on those threats that our customers are facing. And in our Intel portal, you can find a lot of the information I think that you're looking for, not from North Korea, but from other countries of interest and actors of interest, if those are yours.
Actually, talking about North Korea and what you said before about using soft power and diplomacy, I don't think it works in North Korea. That's one country that's actually where the state sponsorship is actually going to be the way they operate, because it's bringing in hard revenue for North Korea through all their cybercrime activities, and that's the reality. But I guess there's the ability to apply things like the Magnitsky Act and so forth to actually sanction individuals in the regime, and that's something that I think we don't have that kind of act in place in Australia yet, but there are people advocating for it. So you can actually use that as part of the harder part of soft power, if you like, to actually force uncooperative regimes to actually honor the rules-based international law. We don't have another question, but I'll actually ask a question of you at this time. We've talked a little bit about state and non-state actors, and in my view, there's this whole issue of the grey zone, which tends to be expanding like the universe. You know, it's the separation, it's the grey space between peace and war, and because of the difficulty in attribution, certain actors are playing a lot more in that space. And I talked about the legislative changes that have been introduced in Australia, which entitles the government to do certain things. But having said that, they are constrained by that legislation as much as they are entitled to act in the context of that legislation. In a lot of less democratic countries and a lot of autocratic countries, the blending between the state sector and the private sector, such as it is not there. It's merged into one. So you have state actors and non-state actors working very closely together. So there's really two dimensions to the to grey zone activity, in that we're seeing a lot more activity in that space, and we're seeing a combination of state and state sanctioned actors working together in harmony in that space. There's probably triggers for that. We think in Australia there's probably a trigger around AUKUS, you know, are acquiring nuclear submarines. That certainly is not going to please China. Will they actually take on more grey zone activity against Australia? They've certainly attacked our parliament in the past in terms of a cyber attack, and that was attributed to China. Do you think we should expect to see more of those types of attacks?
I would think it's a resourcing perspective, right? So, you know, when you look at these cyber criminal groups, if they're operating with impunity, you know, odds are there's a reason they're getting that you know, ceiling to protect them. So, you know, I think some governments and some cyber criminals within those countries, you know, it's sometimes more covert and sometimes more open. So, you know, you'll see nations like China actually searching for cyber criminals on underground forums actually to conduct their activities. So they're very, you know, obvious about it. And then you look at other nations like Eastern Europe and Russia, where, you know, it's not as clear where the gray zone is, right? So certainly I think we see that today. You know, I don't think it's a trend that's going away. I think for as long as there's been this type of activity, there's been that type of activity of using, you know, public people to or people in general that are citizens to conduct the activity that they may want to do. So, you know, I think it's something that we'll see in the future as well. And you know, the gray zone, as you say, is very much real. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't help thinking that some of the ransomware, and certainly people have talked in this way, could actually be converted into dual use in that area too. So, for example, rather than extorting a ransom or extracting some payment for not publishing information on making it public on GitHub or wherever, if that same platform is used to actually exfiltrate the whole host of information from critical infrastructure and form part of a grey zone activity, that certainly is a scenario that concerns me. Look, I think we've probably, unless you've got any further closing remarks, there are no more questions. And Nick, I want to thank you greatly for taking this time at 5 a.m. or now 6 a.m. your time.
It's morning time. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Gary, and thanks to everyone for joining us. Really appreciate it. Always a pleasure speaking with you. You challenge me every time, so I appreciate that.
And I love our conversations. I look forward to the next one. Thanks,
Excellent.
Nick.
Thanks a lot, Gary. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.